Baruch Hashem. Today's Daf Yomi is Zevachim Daf Ches, Zevachim 38, Chodesh Tov, and the first day of Chodesh Cheshvan. So we're going to start on the bottom of Zayin Amabez, 7 lines from the bottom. The Gemara wants to know what's the source for Beis Hillel's position that if you only do one application of the blood of the chatas with your finger on the horns of the altar, that's sufficient. Whereas Beis Shammai says you need a minimum of 2. So the Gemara first suggested that the dispute between them is that Beis Shammai says yesh aim or mikra. We give primacy to the way the Torah is pronounced, whereas Beis Hillel says we give primacy to the way it is written, yesh aim or michtav. And so yesh aim or mesores, that we give it to the way it is written, to the Masoretic text. And so therefore they take the words karnos, 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 which according to our text of the Talmud, which does not 100% align with our accepted traditional text of the Torah, there are, the first 2 letters are written without, the first 2 times the horns of the altar appears without the letter Vav, and the last time it appears with the letter Vav, which without the Vav it's singular, with the Vav it's plural. And so therefore Beis Shammai follows it as six mentions of the words horns, 4 to say it's a mitzvah, and 2 that are essential required, whereas Beis Hillel says you have 4 horns, and therefore to tell us that 3 are for mitzvah and 1 is a require, and 1 is 3 is ideal and 1 is absolute requirement. And the Gemara had a question with that, and so the Gemara said maybe they're all just ideal but never required. That was no, you need at least something. And then the Gemara gave an alternative answer, meaning to say Beis Hillel says, no, I accept both the concept of yesh aim mikra and yesh aim mesoret. And the verse, basically, it's a compromise. Since yesh aim mikra will get us to 6, and yesh aim mesoret will get us to 4, so we do a compromise and we say 4 are for mitzvah, and the one in the middle is for requirement. So that will get us 1 requirement according to Beis Hillel. Meaning you have to do it at least once. Meaning to say, he says, ahani mikra tefuya chada, ahani mesoret lebetzuri chada. Yesh aim mikra increases 1, and yesh aim mesoret deletes 1. So if that's the case, as the Gemara in our daf Almayata, if that's the case, hold on one second. Hold on, just give me 1 second. Okay, fine. So if that's the case, says the Gemara, if that's the case, pasukos. If that's the case, lototafos. When it says the words lototafos in the tefillin, and according to our version of the Talmud, which is again not consistent with our current accepted minhag of the Torah, no, it's written totafos without the vav twice and once in the plural. So that should get us to 4. Ahani krav, ahani mesoros, chamisha bate ba'il mevid. So if you do the same idea, it would be 6 and 4, and you get to 5. Maybe you should make 5 compartments of the tefillin, not like we have, which are 4. So Gemara says Beis Hillel is several like Rabbi Akiva. He holds like Rabbi Akiva, who says tat bekatfi is shtayim and pat ba'afriki is shtayim. So he says that that the word tat in katfi is 2. And in African is 2, and that gets us to 4. So therefore, we have a concept of 4 because we have it from the word totafot, which takes to 4. Why is the Torah giving us African words and Katfian words? So that's also from our parsha this week, Parshas Noach. It says that the whole world was safachat in the generation in Tower of Babel. So that teaches us that the original language of the world was Lashon HaKodesh. Rashi says Hebrew, and from there we get all the other languages. So even though we call it African, it's originally Hebrew. So if that's the case, says the Gemara, Me'ata basukos, we should apply the same concept. Ahani mikra v'ahani mesoros, according to Beis Hillel, chamisha dafnasa ba'al mevi. You should make 5 walls of the sukkah, not 4. Same concept. So the Gemara says, no. Hasam on top of Amachasam and off. Hasam chadkra. There's only 1 pasuk. Excuse me. There, Hasam chadkra kule legufe. Hold on 1 second. I'm just getting a little nervous here. Hold on 1 second. So the Gemara says Hasam chadkra kule legufe. No, so there we need one of the psukim of the sukkah, one pasuk entirely to tell us about the mitzvah of sukkah, and then we're left with 4 times that the word sukkah appears. V'chad l'schach, one is to teach us about schach, and also yochas of a garasa l'shlishis, and then the halacha Moshe Sinai comes along and removes the third one and diminishes it. Ukimta tefach, and says you only need 2 and a tefach. So if that's the case, says the Gemara El Me'ata, if that's the case, what about Tumeya Shvuayim? It says by a woman who gives birth, a Yoledes, that we read it as she's Tumeya for 2 weeks. But you could also read that word as Shivim, as 70 days. We're on the top of Lamed Ches, Lamed Aleph, Chodesh Tov, we're on the top of 38a. But you could also read it as she's Tumeya for 2 weeks or for 7 days. Ahani Krai V'Hani Mesoris, Arba Mitarin Ba'ila Mesav. You should really have 42 days, because you should take 70 and 14, take the difference, which is 56, and take half of that, which is 28, and get to 42 days. So she should have to say 42 days of Tumah. Gemara says, no, Shani also in that case is different. It says at the very beginning of that passage that it says she will Shvuayim Kenidasa. She'll be Shvuayim like a Nida, and it has to be closer to a Nida. I guess the simplest way to understand it, Nida is 1 week, and Kenida says weeks, not days. So it's more likely to read it as weeks and not days. That's the way commentaries explain it. So both Chodesh Tov, we're on 38a, 5 lines from the top. The Tana Ma'isile Me'alacha. So we're just finished actually 2 explanations about why Beis Hillel says that 1 application of the blood from your finger on the horns of the altar is sufficient. And now the Gemara is going to cite a third possibility. There's a Tana who brings a proof for this idea for Beis Hillel's position from the following source. Tana Ma'isle Me'alacha. It says v'chiper. When it comes to the applications of the blood on the horns of the altar, it says by a sin offering, it says the word v'chiper 3 times. It says v'chiper lavakohem echataso v'nislacho. It says it in Vayikra Daled Pasuk Chavav, and also says it in Pasuk Lamed Aleph, V'chipar lavakohen v'nislacho, and it also says it in Lamed Hey, V'chipar lavakohen al chataso. So since it says v'chipar 3 times, to teach us this idea that you only need to apply it once. How? Because the Gemara says, din, because you might have thought, I don't need a pasuk. Sheyachol, I could have arrived at this position logically. Dinu. Nemru damim lamatav and nemru damim lamala. It says that you have to apply blood under some karbanos below the chut hasikra, the middle line of the mizbeach. And nemru damim lamala, and also by the chata says you have to apply the blood above. Mamat and damim mamurim lamata, just like the blood of the karbanos that's applied below. According to everyone, even Beis Shammai, if you do 1 application of the blood below, it's sufficient. Also, the blood that's applied above, also, if you by the chatas, if you apply 1 blood above, it should be sufficient. Or maybe go in the opposite direction. By the mizbeach Hapnimis, by the inner altar, it also says blood, and also by the external altar, it says blood. Just like by the inner altar, just like by the inner altar, if you're missing 1 of the blood, as it said in our Mishnah, if you're missing even 1 application of blood, all the carbon is not acceptable. Maybe also by this external offering, if you're missing 1, it's no good. So so who should we compare it to? We should compare it to the chatas, which is outside, on the mizbeach that's outside, to the other karbanos which are on the mizbeach that are outside. And don't compare it to the ones that are applied inside. Or maybe just the opposite. Maybe you learn out the law of the chatos and the 4 horns on the outer altar. From also there is a chatos and the 4 horns on the inner altar. So maybe that's more logical. And don't compare it to the other karbanos that are outside, which is not a chatas and the 4 horns, because it's below the chut hasikra. So we can't learn it out from logic. So how should we learn it out? Tamomer v'chiper v'chiper v'chiper. So that we learn it out from the three mentions of the word v'chiper. It'll serve as an atonement. V'chiper, which means alpha pishol nasan elashalosh. It serves as an atonement, even though there's only three applications of the blood. V'chiper alpha pishol natan elashtayim. It serves as atonement even if there would only be two. V'chiper alpha pishol nasan elachas. So be atonement even if there's only one, and that's the source for Beis Hillel's position. Gemara says v'ami ba'alei gufei. But don't we need the word v'chiper to teach us the whole idea that it achieves atonement? Amarava bar Ada, no, Murray Asberly. He says, Murray explained to me, you don't need the chiper to teach us its atonement because it says v'chiper v'nislacho. Every time it says v'chiper, it also says you are forgiven. Zui kapara, zui slicha. So it's telling us they're the same thing. So therefore, why is chiper written if we already have a nislach? It's to teach us this idea that one sin of one application of the blood is enough to fulfill the requirement. So the Gemara says, well, if that's the case, so hold on one second. So the Gemara says maybe the chiper alpha pishal nasan ela shalosh lamala v'achas lamata. Maybe the chiper is teaching us even if you only put three above, but you still need one below. The chiper alpha pishal nasan ela shtayim lamata shtayim lamala. The chiper alpha pishal nasan lamala elamata. Maybe the chiper is teaching us that even if you put it below would be sufficient. Maybe that's what the three times of chiper does. Amar Vadavar Yitzchak. No, im came bital to Torah arba kronos. No, the Torah tells us you need to put the blood of the chatas on the horns of the altar. And if you're going to say that approach, then you don't need the horns of the altar at all. So the Gemara says, well, so what? If that's what the Torah says, if the Torah tells us you don't need it, you don't need it. No, so Rava says, Rava ezu davar shetzarach shalosh havi omer elo kronos. No, Rava gives this answer, which is a little bit opaque. Rava says, what is the matter that needs three? That's the horns. The way Rashi explains this is as follows. Rashi says, because the iyav kul mata kosher arba v'chiper havalelim miltav. If there would have been sufficient to put them all below and be kosher, then it should have written four times word kiper. Hachsher arba matanos mata. Tell us that arba matanos are coming below. That's the way Rashi understands this point of Rava. So the Gemara says, "But ema v'chiper alpha pishol nasan ela achas l'mala v'shalosh l'mata." Maybe v'chiper means even if you only put one above and three below. Maybe that's all it's telling us. The Gemara says, no. We never have an example of a carbon where half of the blood is applied below and half of the blood is applied above. And so you can't say that that's what's going on. The Gemara says, what? Really? V'lo v'atanan. He's mimenu achas l'mala v'shevel mata. And this refers to the Holy of Holies on Yom Kippur, that it says they have to sprinkle the blood al panei kaporas kedma. And the Gemara's assumption here is that you have to first do one on the top thickness of the kaporas. The kaporas is the cover of the ark, and the other seven below the midpoint of the kaporas. The Gemara says, no, that's not what it means. It means kematzlif. It means that when you apply the blood by the kaporas, you have to do it like a matzlif. What's a matzlif? My matzlif. Machve Rav Yehuda kim mangata. He showed him to him. It's like a angata. So what this means is that it means that the first one is applied like this with your hands facing upward, and the second, and the remaining seven are applied with your hands facing below. And Rashi says it means that they're next to each other, like a whip, that you're all whipping next to each other. So then the Gemara says, what about the fact that it says he's al tarosh al mizbeach sheva pamim? It says that you have to sprinkle it. It says on Yoma that you have to sprinkle it also after you come out of the Holy of Holies. You go to the Kohen Gadol goes to the golden altar and he sprinkles it there 7 times. And the assumption is, how do you do that? What does it mean taharo? What does it mean the taharo shel mizbeach? Doesn't that mean the middle of the mizbeach? Doesn't mean the midpoint of this golden altar. And says Rashi, since it's impossible on the top of 38b, since it's impossible to get it exactly in the middle, it must be partially above and partially below. As people say, that is the middle point of the day. No, it means the top of the altar. So it just means the top, as it says in the pasuk that what the Bnei Yisrael they saw clearly, and so too it refers to the revealed part of the altar. Gemara says, what about Vayika Shirayim? That after you apply the chatas on the top of the peach and the horns, you pour the remnants of the blood to the yesod, to the base. Gemara says, well, Shirayim will ma'akvi. Shirayim are not essential. It's a mitzvah, but it's not essential. Gemara says, Vayika Shirayim apnimiyim. The ikamanda amar ma'akvi. But what about the Shirayim of the panimium, the Shirayim of the inner altar? Of the chatas apanimium, the sin offerings of the inner altar, that they would pour to the base of the altar. We're going to earn on nun bezim and all. But there is a position that those are essential. Now the Gemara says, yeah, when we say this law that you don't have one blood above and one blood below, that's on the same altar. On two different altars, you'll have it. So anyway, just to summarize what we said, how does Beis Hillel know that there's one, that if you just do one application of blood by the chatas, it's sufficient? We saw two explanations. That one explanation is that he says he follows Yesh Emu Masoros. We follow the way it's written in the Torah, and therefore, since it says karnos a total of 4 times, 3 are mitzvah and 1 is a requirement. And then there's a second explanation, is that he takes the compromise position between Yeshem and Mikra, Yeshem and Masoros. And so those who say Yeshem and Mikra will get 6, whereas Yeshem and Masoros gets 4. And so then you get 4 are a mitzvah and 1 is a requirement. And then we have this third brayso, which is v'chiper, v'chiper, v'chiper. And that's to teach us, even if you only apply once, it's sufficient. So the Gemara says, Tanya, Rabbi Eliezer ben Yaakov, Omer, Beis Shammai, Omer, Shtei Matana shebechatas, because Beis Shammai says, bechatas, I actually only require 2 applications. A mitzvah is 4, but 2 is sufficient. So those 2 applications of the chatas, and the 1 application by all other karbanos, matiros umefaglos, they are going to be the matir. That's going to be what will allow the meat to be eaten. And there'll also be the mefaglos, meaning to say, as long as those 2 are not applied, then you can't burn the emurin on the altar, and you can't eat the meat. And also, if you have a pigul thought, if you have to do the pigul thought by one of them, but if you don't do the pigul thought by both of them, if you don't do it by both of them, it's not going to be considered pigul. The improper thought has to apply by both applications of the blood. And that's because the pigul has to come on the matir, there's a thought on the matirim, and not on half of the matirim. Whereas Beis Hillel says, Achas shebechatas v'achas shebekol Zevachim, Beis Hillel says, no, just the one application by the chatas and by all the Zevachim are materas and mefagelas. So it turns out, so Maska for Rav Oshia, Imkain listening Gavikua Beis Shammai v'chomer Beis Hillel. Well, if that's the case, Beis Hillel is more lenient here. Beis Hillel is more stringent here, because he says if you just did the pigul thought on one of the applications, it's pigul, or Beis Shammai requires it on both. And the Mishnah in Eidos lists all those cases where Beis Shammai is lenient, and Beis Hillel is stringent. Why isn't this listed amongst those cases? So Rava says, no. When this question was asked in the Beis Medrash, and they explained it, they asked about the meat. They said, can we eat this meat? Where there was only 1 application of blood that was given for the chatas. And so under those circumstances, Beis Hillel says yes, and Beis Shammai says no. So under those circumstances, Beis Hillel is going to be more lenient than Beis Shammai. So when it comes to stringencies and leniencies, it's also a matter of the perspective. So Beis Shammai, in those circumstances, Beis Shammai was actually strict as it came to eating the meat. Even though he's more lenient when it comes to pigul, he's more strict when it comes to meat. Amar Rabbi Yochanan, Shalosh Mantanos Shebechatos, so these remaining three applications of the blood by the Chatas, according to Beit Hillel, because only the first one is an absolute requirement. So we have some general rules about them. Ein on boas b'layla. You can't bring them at night. Meaning to say, even though they're not essential and it's not an actual application of the blood, nevertheless, the blood becomes disqualified with the setting of the sun. And also, ubaos achar misa. But once a person dies, you're still able to bring them, even though you don't bring a chatas after death. But if you did the first application and then the owner died, well, he's already received atonement. And so therefore the chatas the blood doesn't have the name of the chatas on it to become disqualified, like a chatas whose owner died. But if you bring them up on an altar outside the courtyard of the temple, you're going to be liable, because they're still able to be thrown upon the altar. And so therefore, if there's a service that can be done inside the courtyard and you do it outside, you're liable. Rav Papa comes on and says, Yeshman kitchilaso, the Yeshman kisofa. There are some that are like some, meaning to say like the law of the first application of the blood, and there are some like the law of the final application of the blood. Chutz, if you bring the blood outside, v'layla, doing it at night, zaros, a non-Kohen doing it, the kli, and that it requires a kli that you need to put them on the altar from a kli, or a karen that you need to put them on the horn, ve'etzba, with your finger, or kibus. I'll come back to kibus in a second, and shirayim, and that you have to pour the remnants. If you put the blood from a different cup, the finger from each. For the blood comes from a different cup, it has to be poured on the base. All of them are ketchilas, and they all have the law of the first one. What's the law of kibus? That there's a pasuk in the Torah that says if the blood from the chata sprinkles, if you have a chatas and you're ready to sprinkle that blood on the mizbeach, and meaning to say after you do the first application of the blood on the altar, then some of the blood falls on your garment. The garment requires washing inside the courtyard of the temple. It says kasher yizah midama beged asher yizaleh tichabes b'makom kadosh. But if the blood falls after you apply the first application of the blood, then it requires kibus as though it was sprinkled before. But if it falls on the garment after all of the four applications of the blood, then the garment does not require this law of washing, as the Gemara is going to explain. So misa, but if it comes after the owner's death, lo sharia, then we're going to say that does not allow. So the blood that comes after the owners of the death, that does not allow the meat to be in, because it was already in by the first one, and it doesn't cause pickle. And if they go into the sanctuary, it doesn't become disqualified, kisofan. And that is like the law of Shirayim. Amar Papa Minamino, Amar Papa says, where do I know this halacha? That if the blood gets on the garments after the first application of the blood, the garment is going to require kibus. The Tanan nitaz minat savar ala beged, because it says if the blood sprinkles from the neck straight onto the garment, enotan kibus, then it does not require kibus, because it first needs to have been received in a utensil, and so therefore it's not ready for sprinkling, so it does not require the washing. And also minat karen, if the blood sprinkles from the karen, or mina yesod, if the blood sprinkles from the karen or the yesod, from the horns or the base, it also does not require kibus, because that all the blood was applied under those circumstances. Hamina royal karen, but if it was something that was still waiting to go in the horn, i.e., applications 2 through 4, ton kibus, it requires kibus. Gemara says, according to your logic, B'nai Yesod ain't ton kibus, from the base it does not require kibus. Hamina royal yesod, but if it's waiting to go on the yesod, it ton kibus, meaning to say before it was poured out, it would require, and it's spilled on the clothes, it would require this law of kibus. Asher yizeksiv prat l'zeshek farhuza, but it can't be, because it says So I show you Zexiv, which comes to exclude something that was already sprinkled. So it does require kibbutz. So Gemara says, no, who is the Tana who says that also the blood of the Shirayim requires kibbutz? Amani, Rabbi Nechemiah. Rabbi Nechemiah says also the blood that's waiting to be poured on the foundation, if it gets on the clothing, it does require kibbutz. And we'll see where does he say that? The Tanah, because we learned in the Mishnah, Rabbi Nechemiah says, Shiyari Adam, the blood of the Shirayim, even though they're not essential, Shekrivam B'chutz, that if you brought outside the altar, Chayiv, you're going to be liable for kares. So we see from here that Rabbi Nechemiah says you're liable for kares if you bring it outside. So he views it as actual blood. And so therefore, it would also be the case here that he requires kibbutz. We're going to discuss that more in tomorrow's daf. A big shikoyach to everybody. A chodesh tov.